Hello, this is a short intro video using the Elements of Craft handout just to kind of introduce story before you do the reading from Burroway and the reading from Tomlinson. And they're going to elaborate a lot more on this than what I'm going to do right here. And then there's going to be a second part about story and plot that we're going to go much more in detail with. But I just kind of want to introduce it, and then you guys will do the readings, and then we'll go more in depth. So the parts of a story are the the big part is narrative arc and then structure. But we're going to do a whole different video and content module on structure because there's a lot to structure. There are several different forms and several different ways that you can manipulate structure. So the narrative arc, and we'll go over this a little bit more in detail in the next video. You guys have all heard of the narrative arc, which contains the inciting incident, conflict, crisis, or rising action, climax, falling action, and then resolution, the ending. But there's several different ways that you can reorganize your narrative arc by manipulating structure. And we'll get much more in depth with that. Most stories have a protagonist versus antagonist story. This is not necessarily true. And the antagonist can be, and we'll talk about this more when we get to character, but your antagonist does not necessarily have to be a person. It could be, inner demons in the protagonist. It could be the setting that the story takes place in. So the antagonist is not necessarily the villain of the story. There could be, the antagonist could be much more abstract. And we'll talk about that a lot more when we get to character. And then the first reading that you're going to do is by Janet Burroway. And Burroway breaks down struggle into these three, breaks down story into these three concepts. Story as a journey, story as a power struggle, and then story as connection and disconnection. So when you do that reading, you'll get much more in depth with that. And then the Tomlinson reading goes even more in depth. And then in the next video, we're going to get really in depth with all of this stuff. One thing I want to say though is that often they tell you this in writing programs to think of your story as, and this is a metaphor for it, but to think of your story as you're taking your protagonist, you're making us care about your protagonist in some form or another. We don't necessarily have to like them. We'll talk about this more when we get to character too. We have to have a strong emotional connection to your protagonist. We either love him and want him to win, or we hate him and want him to fail. So you take your protagonist, you make the reader care about the protagonist, then you put them in a tree, and then you throw rocks at them and see what they do. That's just kind of a silly metaphor that they tell you in grad programs, but it works because you have to develop the protagonist, make us care about him in one form or another, and then you put him through, conflict, crisis, climax, falling action. You put him in situations, interesting situations that are tense, and then we just kind of sit back and look at what the protagonist does. So that's kind of just the fundamentals of story. You're going to do the readings next, and then we're going to get much more in depth.